And the big problem we've got at the moment is that over the last sort of 30, 40 years, we've seen the wave climate increasing by about 0.4% per year on average, which isn't a lot. But when you accumulate that up, you're looking at 30, 40% increases in the overall wave energy in our oceans compared with when mid-19th century. When they break, they unleash a huge amount of power. It's very difficult or very unadvisable in many ways to try to stop the crest of a wave. It can be moving quite fast and it contains a lot of energy. So what natural reefs do, and what we're trying to do is in trying to effectively simulate natural reefs.
Welcome to Mindful Businesses, presented by Sarani, and I'm your host, Vidya Iyer. In our podcast, we bring to you brands that are mindful in their practices and processes. A mindful business adopts and employs sustainable social, economic, and environmental practices. Today, we talk with Dr. William Bateman, founder and CEO of CCell, growing living reefs for coastal protection. Welcome, Dr. Bateman.
Thank you, Vidya, for inviting us to Mindful Business.
One of the changes that is very apparent in the present global warming and the climate change that we are experiencing is the disappearance of our beaches. How quickly, when you go to your favorite beach and 2 years later, you can see that the coastal lines have been washed away, they've receded. Do you have some statistics or some numbers for us?
From the work that we've done, we think about 51% of all beaches are actually receding. I mean, to counter that, you've got about 30% of beaches that are actually growing in size. The remainder, sort of 19% odd, are just not really moving. There has been a notable shift in the last 10, maybe 20 years. Normally, you would expect the number of beaches sort of growing and receding to be more or less in balance. Due to climate change, there's been quite a big shift. So we're seeing significantly more beaches eroding, exactly as you explained.
So when they erode from one location, when all the sand goes from one location, does it just sink to the bottom of the ocean or does it move to another shore?
Most of the sand that you see on beaches is constantly in motion. So normally it is sort of, I wouldn't say rolling, but it's effectively sort of drifting very slowly up the coastline. And that's an ongoing process that's been, happening for years. What happens when people put obstructions into the sea, say, for example, they build a pier or harbour, they can deflect sand that would otherwise have travelled up, to further out into deeper water. And then the other way you can lose sand is through storms, because storms can come in and rip away sand. And if you get strong enough currents, those currents can again take the sand into deep water where it's lost. The way to think about this is sort of rivers, erosion on the shore, big pebbles being broken up into small pebbles, is all providing that sort of material. A majority of sediment actually comes down the rivers, particularly things like the Amazon River. Those are all providing a source of material for our beaches. You've then got the deep ocean is effectively like a sink. The challenge is to try to avoid that sediment from going too far out offshore so it's lost forever, is to keep it close to the shore. And then in those situations, and there's many islands and many case studies looking at this, where you have, for example, the Maldives, you may find the sand actually just moves, the beach one year maybe more prominent on the north face, and then another year it may be more prominent on the southern face or on the eastern face. And the sand is, routinely just kind of going on a trip around the island. The problem, though, is climate change, bigger waves are upsetting those patterns. And the big problem we've got at the moment is that since over the last sort of 30, 40 years, we've seen the wave climate increasing by about 0.4% per year on average, which isn't a lot. But when you accumulate that up, you're looking at 30, 40% increases in the overall wave energy in our oceans compared with when mid-19th century. And the result of that is it's changing a lot of things. Now, what's interesting is we're only starting to see the real effects of that in the last 10, 15 years. So where I've been working in Mexico, they used to have beaches which are 30, 40 meters wide, and they're now 2 meters.
Wow.
They've lost a substantial amount of sand in literally 10 years.
So the climate change with the hurricanes and changes in where rain falls more now as against, where they used to fall. So these things change how the storms change the waves change what is eroded from the sand. And that is the cycle that we are talking about.
Yes, and you've actually raised a very good point that I hadn't thought about. I mean, the changing rainfall patterns will also change the amount of erosion of the land and the amount of sediment it actually adds into the system. You would assume that maybe it would provide more sediment, but it's not necessarily the case. If the rivers are swollen and they're running very fast, they can take sediment far out into the sea when they eventually meet the sea, whereas perhaps historically it would have been much more gentle deposition of sand closer to the shore.
As these beaches erode, we have a favorite beach in Indiana Dunes, and the spot, the sand literally was carved out. They had to build steps coming down from the sandbank to the beach, which was a few years back was a gradual slope.
Yeah.
And they had to bring in humongous boulders to prop up the remaining sand wall, shall we say.
That's a common feature. That's been repeated around the world. I mean, I've just come back from Israel and they've got 45 kilometers of coastline where they've got big cliffs, 10, 20 meters high that are just descending into the ocean through the erosion you talk about. And it's fairly simple to think about. When you get larger waves, they come towards the shore, they crash onto the shore. When they break, they unleash a huge amount of power. It's very difficult or very unadvisable in many ways to try to stop the crest of a wave. It can be moving quite fast and it contains a lot of energy. So what natural reefs do, and what we're trying to do is in trying to effectively simulate natural reefs, is by being out at sea, they're creating, they're a bulge under the water. And as those waves come in, the energy beneath those waves gets channeled up towards the surface, which causes those waves to steepen and destabilize and then break. And if you can do that, the crest of that wave is breaking onto the water, it effectively destroys itself. So by the time it then gets to the shore, it do all that much damage. And now the mistake that a lot of people make when they think about coastal protection is they, as you say, they go out and put these large boulders in. Now you can put the boulders along the shore, and that's almost like a last-ditch attempt, defense against those waves. Because when those waves come in, they're going to just smash against those boulders. So what a lot of people now do is they put breakwaters further out to sea. Again, those are, by putting them out to sea, you are, those breaking waves are no longer anywhere near to the land. And you hope then behind these breakwaters, you'll see a build-up of sand, which is typically what happens. But what's often the mistake is that they build these structures so they go right through the surface and actually cut off all of the waves that are trying to reach the shore. And smaller waves very often are good. Not only do they help to circulate the water, but actually when you see smaller waves coming up to a beach and they break, they actually push sand onto the shore. So they actually help to build up I wouldn't say build up sand dunes, but they certainly build up some of the banks of sand on your beach.
So what would be a good solution for this beach, say, that we are talking about?
It's often a combination. If you've got really bad erosion already and you are, say there's a building or sacred site or something in imminent danger, then you do need to actually reinforce the shore directly. Otherwise, what we're promoting are much more softer solutions. So you try to build something very similar to a coral reef, sort of 100, maybe 200 meters off from shore, and you affect a change in that wave climate before those waves reach the shore. Because once upon a time, those shores were perfectly okay. The waves were in harmony with the existing shoreline. All that's changed is that we've just got more intense waves and we need to dampen those waves and get back to where we were. The only thing I would add to that, by the way, is that some shorelines have always been eroding. I don't know if you've been to London, to England, but the White Cliffs of Dover, which are quite famous on the southern coast, they remain white because of constant erosion. So that's just a given. That's mirrored in many other places in the world. And there are places where the beaches have been getting bigger and they've been effectively accumulating sand for a very long time. We need to be doing now is trying to just take off the slightly aggressive effects of the increased increased intensity of the bigger waves due to climate change.
So we have seen the coastal erosions happening at a faster scale than in history. What is your solution?
We seek to mimic natural coral reefs.
What are coral reefs?
Coral reefs it's hard to describe. They're kind of like a half animal, half plant. They're actually live, but they have algae growing within them, which is the plant element of them. And corals are, there's a whole range. It's a bit like the animal kingdom. There's a whole variety of different corals, everything from very hard sort of brain corals to, I think, what they're called sort of staghorn corals, which grow quite quickly but look a little bit like the horns of a reindeer, and everything in between. What people often don't realize is there are warm water corals, there's also cold water corals. So there are corals around the UK which are in colder waters, but we more often think about the corals around Australia in the Great Barrier Reef. Those are stunning and incredible habitat for fish and marine life. Collectively, corals are excruciatingly, well, that's probably not the right word, but corals are extremely important for the life that we have. So they are responsible for providing a habitat for about 25% of all marine life. They're either born in or live in corals. It's estimated that there are around about 1 billion people. 1 billion people's livelihoods are directly dependent on corals. And there are about 200 million, we estimate, of people who are directly protected by corals from larger waves. I've mentioned the Maldive Islands a couple of times, but large stretches of the Yucatan or Quintana Roo coastline are similarly sort of protected in that way. And in many ways, we treat corals a bit like air. We all breathe air, we see it as something that's just there, and we take it for granted. And corals have been quietly providing an awful lot of sort of services to mankind, and we've just taken them for granted. And sadly, without a significant change in the way that we are operating this world, we are likely to see about 95% of all corals killed off in the next 20 to 30 years.
Our family was visiting Hawaii one time, and they took us to a place where they had artificially created coral reefs with shipwrecks and some other submerged materials, man-made materials. So how do they start growing? If you said it's part animal, part plant.
Coral needs something solid to hold on to. So when you have a shipwreck or you have a piece of rock, you can take a section of coral and place them onto them. And corals are quite remarkable. They are a little bit like a iguana. If an iguana loses its tail, it regrows it very quickly. A coral, when it's cut or it fragments, the segment that remains will actually regrow quite rapidly. So what a lot of scientists are doing is they, after, say, a storm or where there's been some form of damage, they will collect up the fragments of those corals. They will bring them back to the lab and help to sort of nurture them back into a larger size or health. And then they will go out and find pieces of solid or rock or whatever down there to attach them on. They will regrow. What we do is we are installing essentially a dome structure in the ocean. That starts off as being made of steel, and then we use a process called electrolysis to actually, in a sense, harvest minerals that are naturally found in the seawater to form rock around our steel structure. So it effectively becomes covered in a layer of concrete. It's a completely natural concrete.
How quickly does this coral grow? Years? Decades?
Yeah, corals take decades to grow. It's fairly slow, but what they've been able to do around the fragmentation of corals is they can get them to grow sort of 20 times faster than normal. And through the electrolytic process that we do, you can get corals to grow sort of 3, maybe 5 times faster. I mean, it depends a little on the coral species and also where they are.
So what is your innovation?
Our work is around actually creating that bedrock. So we're not about creating corals or growing corals, but in particular, we're just trying to create that lump in the water so that when the waves come in, we cause those waves to break before they continue further onto the shore. And at the same time, what we're doing is we're providing the foundations on which you can then plant corals in warm waters. You might use oysters in colder waters, and there's work we're now doing to experiment with that in the Isle of Man. And at the same time, the structure provides a fantastic habitat for fish, just like natural coral reefs do. So we're getting all the same benefits, but we're creating a structure that would otherwise take hundreds, if not thousands of years to form in a matter of weeks.
In a matter of weeks?
Yeah, we would install the structure within a week. Then the rock that we grow on the structure would form over, say, 4 to 6 months.
Actually, in Japan, there are man-made coral reefs which serve as a habitat for fishes to increase fish yield for the fishermen.
It's the same basic principle. I mean, I don't know specifically what they're doing in Japan, but if you can create a structure that is above the sand, because very little will live in the sand. I mean, seagrasses will, but if you put a coral in sand, it just gets lost and smothered. So you want something that lifts it up from the seafloor. So I suspect what the Japanese are doing is creating some form of intricate structures. They can either put the corals onto them, but anything will, any form of shelter, any form of sort of intricate network will support fish. What's really quite amazing about this sort of, the whole marine ecosystem, if you think about fish, one of the reasons a lot of corals have died is not because of climate change specifically. It's because they have been smothered in algae. And that's because normally you'd have an abundance of fish that will come in and eat all the algae and keep them clean. And when they've been overfished, or the area's been overfished, then there's a knock-on impact onto the corals. Fish also provide an awful lot of nutrients for things like seagrass, so that they poop like the rest of us. That settles on the sand, and that provides the nutrients for seagrass to grow. Seagrass, in turn, has been shown to be phenomenal at filtering the water. It helps to remove microplastics. It helps to remove pollution that might otherwise kill the corals. But at the same time, seagrass is also a sort of wonder plant. It's something like 35 to 50 times more effective at removing CO2 than the healthy equivalent of the Amazon rainforest. I have to say healthy because de-logging and all the rest of it, the rainforest is not performing quite so well at the moment. As you can see, there's this whole chain, and what we're doing is trying to get in at the top there and say, like, we'll provide the structure, and then we want to initiate the growth of all of these other things in and around our reef, effectively trying to work totally in harmony with nature.
Describe the process. So you build the steel structures, you plant the corals.
We would start by company. The first thing we do is gather as much data as we can about an area. So we would then model very carefully all of the waves, the currents, and what's going on. That's then followed through, ultimately ends up with a design for a particular site. And if the client's happy with that, we would then manufacture the steel frames. So they're then placed in the ocean. Into that, we then run a small electrical current through the water that causes the electrolysis to happen and causes the rock to grow on the structure. Then after probably about 4 months, if we have a suitable supply of corals, we can actually plant those on. Or as I said earlier, in colder waters, we might put oysters. But to be honest, the corals and the oysters are not an essential part of what we need to do. They're just what we want to get established onto those structures, and certainly after sort of 6 months. They then become almost the guardians of that reef, carrying it forward into the future.
Does this require maintenance?
It will do, in the sense that if you have a strong storm and it causes any damage to the reef, if a hurricane comes up and picks up a ship and it throws it through our structures, of course they're going to get damaged. So what we can do is we're monitoring our reefs 24/7. So we have installations in Mexico, in the Isle of Man at the moment, and in Spain, and all of those we can actually control and monitor from here in London. If we do need to provide any sort of maintenance in terms of the rock that's on those structures, we can. We're less worried about deformation of the actual structure itself. If the steel structure gets hit and bent a little bit, that's actually okay. After all, if you think about normal natural coral reefs, they are a little bit random and they're varied. So having that variability within the structure is actually okay. What we want to do is stop the actual structure rusting until enough rock is formed to actually provide the core strength to the reef.
What is the typical application? Who would be your customer? Governments, hotel resorts who want to preserve their shoreline? Who is a typical customer for CCell?
All of the above. So we are working with hotels because particularly coastal hotels have a very close correlation between the amount of sand on their beach and what they can charge, or even the occupancy rates of their rooms. If you go on a summer holiday and you arrive there and you're expecting a beach and there isn't one, you're going to very quickly write back and say, don't come here. Similarly, our first big project was with a coastal community. So a number of houses came together and we installed our reef in front of them. There they have spent upwards of about $1,000 per square meter for their land. And, if they lose a meter in a year and say your property's 10 meters wide or even 20 meters wide, you've suddenly lost 10,000 or 20,000 pounds or dollars worth of real estate. I mean, it's literally your money is just washed out the door. They have a very vested interest. Governments are genuinely interested in kind of all of it. Governments, particularly the local governments, want to promote tourism. Their interests go a little bit more deeper in the sense that they are interested both in terms of maintaining the marine environment or enhancing the marine environment. So they put a lot of attention into what's going on with coral reefs and other sort of plant life or the fishing, etc. They also touch base with the fishing communities. An awful lot of the places we're operating in Mexico they're not wealthy. So you have long fishing communities all the way along that coastline, and now having to go further and further afield to catch fish. So, again, the governments in Mexico are interested in trying to promote sort of marine reserves to encourage fish stocks, redevelop fish stocks.
How much does this cost? Like, say, for a residential community, their pockets are probably not as deep as governments.
Our sort of throwing it out there sort of number is $1,000 a meter, but it varies wildly depending on what you're doing. So for a very simple installation, it could be as little as, say, $700-800, all the way up to our larger reefs are around about $2,000 a meter. That's US dollars.
Yes. And the break-even point is not too long.
In most cases, no. It's the return on client's investment is often within a year. To give it an example for hotels, we only need to nudge the occupancy rate of a hotel by 1% to 2%, and they've paid for our system. Now, in terms of restoring the beach, that could take longer. It's not just because you erect a structure, it doesn't mean the following day you're going to have this glorious beach. It will take months, if not years, for the sand to gradually redevelop in front of that property.
How do you know that your product is working? That they are restoring the coastlines, the coral reefs are helping us restore the coastlines?
From an initial perspective, we know that coral reefs work. It's not sort of a questionable thing. We know, as I mentioned earlier, the Maldives they literally would not exist if it wasn't for the coral reefs around them. In fact, the coral reefs created the Maldives. The way we know our system's working is, at an initial level, we can see that the waves are smaller after they've traveled across our structure. And then in the longer term is because we see sand building up behind our structures. And then ultimately we see the size of the beach building out. So from the work that we've been doing in northern Yucatan with our biggest structures, we're seeing a very small change to the beach line. But what we have seen is quite a dramatic increase in the amount of sand directly behind our reefs. And that with time will move towards the shore.
How much do you think in the next 5 years, how many miles of coastline will CCell be able to restore?
That's a very good question. I hope within the next couple of years, we will be installing probably about 2 kilometers a year. We're still an early stage company. We want to scale that up. We already have expressions of interest for about 3 kilometers in the next 2 years. Now, of course, not all of those projects will come about, but other projects hopefully will fill in behind that. That's still a tiny drop in what needs to be done. So we need to ultimately be scaling this business. What I'm now doing is, we're working very hard to look at how we're going to finance the business going forward so that we can really ramp up the scaling and the automation within the organization so that we can start to deploy reefs at a much, much larger rate. So towards the end of ideally, within about 6 years, we want to be deploying, I forget the exact numbers, but it's probably about 10 to 15 kilometers a year. In fact, I can tell you that.
What kind of support do you need to achieve these goals? Or resources? Like, what do you need? Policy changes? Or is it just public awareness? What was the coastline? Like, how much of the coastline do you think?
We're hoping next 2 years, we're expecting to install about 2 kilometers of reef, and then we're going to start ramping up quite significantly. So by 2025, our intention is to be installing about 15 kilometers of reef per year. And that's still only a small fraction of what we need to be doing globally. So the business as a whole is expecting to take on, partners. So we're in talks with Terra Army, for example, which is a huge French multinational, and we'll be building similar partnerships with other sort of coastal or engineering companies around the world, so we can provide the expertise and the support so they can help to roll this out.
What do you tell the people who say that you're interfering with nature, that you're playing God?
Very good question. What would I tell them? Of course we are. We are engineers, and we have played God the world over. Cities wouldn't exist, sewage systems wouldn't exist, electricity would not exist if it wasn't for engineering. And arguably, through engineering, we have destroyed this planet. So it's because we've provided cars and ships and aeroplanes that we have a world that's in the state that it's currently in. And to go to the more grim side, the war in Ukraine wouldn't be happening if it wasn't for the fact that engineers across the centuries have developed weapons to facilitate that sort of thing. But what we're hoping to do here at CCell is, we're hoping to work very closely with the scientific community, particularly around marine biology, to engineer something that, unlike those other things, is actually good for the environment. It is actually working in close connection with the environment. We're trying very hard not to introduce any sort of new alien materials into the ocean. Of course, we're making a structure, but we're just trying to create a structure that is formed from the very minerals that corals themselves are formed from, as much as we can be in sync with the marine life.
So in terms of the resources that you need, how are you getting funded?
Good question, a very timely question. We are actually launching a crowdfunding round now. So this follows a previous crowdfunding that we had 2 years ago. And this is it's going to be a smaller round, but we will then be building into, as we move into the following year, bringing in various institutions and various funds to drive our business. Yeah, if you want to get involved in this business and you would like to invest in this business, we'd love to hear from you and just visit our website, so ccell.co.uk.
And they would be able to find the link to your crowdfunding.
Yeah, they can register from there and find our crowdfunding platforms and all of the materials about our work.
With those lofty goals, wishing you all the best. Thank you so much, Dr. Bateman, for coming on Mindful Businesses.
Thank you, Vidya, for inviting me. It's been great to have a chat.
You're listening to Mindful Businesses, hosted and produced by Vidya Iyer. We would love to hear from you. Send us a voice note or an email with your questions or comments for our guests to info@mindfulbusinessespodcast.com. Subscribe, rate, and review us on Apple Podcast. If you learned a thing or two from this episode, share it with one friend. We recorded this podcast in Lafayette, Indiana. Theme music was composed by Tatum Gale. Our marketing assistant is Caitlin Milligan. Our advisors are Jim Stone and Anupama Pastrija. This is Vidya Iyer with Mindful Businesses.